Is there any actual evidence behind a palate reset? In terms of a large amount of evidence, not quite. But there are some biological mechanisms that we can use to our advantage to help us reset our palate. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the taste system. Humans have 5 distinct tastes. These include sweet, sour, salty, umami, and bitter. And for the most part, bitter and sour flavors actually trigger an aversive response, and salty, umami, and sweet flavors cause a rewarding sensation to be sent to the brain. And now all of these receptors have different ligands, and ligands are simply molecules that we ingest that will bind to the receptor and stimulate it. For example, things containing glucose and sucrose will stimulate the sweet receptor. Obviously, sodium chloride will stimulate the salt receptor. For umami, these will actually be stimulated by different fatty acids and different amino acids. The bitter receptor is actually stimulated by chemicals, most notably being caffeine. And the sour receptor is actually a response to acidic molecules like hydrogen, which will be in abundance in acidic foods, such as things like lemons, limes, and vinegar. And we can actually take a step back to see why these taste systems may have adapted. In terms of the bitter and sour receptor, it was actually used to detect chemicals inside of food and deter us from eating them in the future. But as I described, the sweet receptors and the umami receptors really respond to food that are abundant in energy. And these are the 3 macronutrients: carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And when we stimulate these receptors, there's a rewarding response sent to the brain, and this food becomes memorable for the next time. And this contributes to the mental craving for a given food because we remember how good it tasted. One of the main determinants was how much it stimulated our taste buds. And now you may ask, why would we have a salty receptor but not a potassium receptor? The most likely explanation is that throughout evolution, we were at much greater risk of a sodium deficiency. This is because the majority of our calories actually came from fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, and fresh meat. And these foods actually contain an abundance of potassium, but not much sodium. Therefore, it would make sense to have a specific detector for sodium so that we can recognize and remember foods that are high in sodium. But if we had a receptor for potassium that actually caused us to crave potassium, this actually put us at a risk of over-consuming potassium in relation to sodium, which can have some detrimental effects. However, nowadays, our food environment is almost shifted backwards. We are at a very great risk of over-consuming sodium, not only because of the environmental abundance, but because of this innate craving. And sodium itself is not actually bad. However, when we are overeating sodium in relationship to potassium, this is when the kidneys will actually hold on to sodium and cause higher blood pressure and all of the detrimental effects of retaining too much sodium and fluid. However, if we simply consume enough potassium, the kidney does a great job in regulating the amount of sodium and potassium we have and simply excreting what isn't needed. However, in today's modern food environment, most of the foods are deficient in potassium and very rich in sodium. And this craving certainly doesn't help. And truly, we can look at the sweet and umami receptors in the same way. Evolutionarily, we simply didn't have such an abundant environment, and food was oftentimes scarce. So the ability to detect energy in the form of macronutrients inside of food, and the response to remember and crave these foods actually helped us in an environment that we were more prone to starvation. However, nowadays, the environment is far more abundant than ever before. Additionally, the foods in the environment overstimulate these sweet and umami and even salty receptors. And we still get the same response in which we feel extremely rewarded, and we will crave these foods in the future. And obviously, there are so many different hormones and neurotransmitters that cause us to eat and stop eating. And taste is simply just one of them. However, if we look at this kind of evolutionary perspective, you can see that we're much better at regulating our appetite and hunger signals, eating foods that have been available throughout all of our evolution. Specifically, the foods that would have stimulated the sweet receptors are fruit. And in terms of the umami receptors, it would simply be animal proteins such as eggs and meat. And if you were never exposed to any sort of processed foods, you would find these foods extremely appetizing and flavorful. Therefore, not only would you enjoy your diet, but you would also be able to control your appetite to maintain a healthy weight. But the problem is that when we expose our palate to some of the foods in the modern environment, they stimulate the same taste receptors, except they actually cause a downregulation in their sensitivity. Through the same process of upregulation and downregulation that almost every physiological function has, when we overstimulate a given pathway, we reduce our sensitivity. And in terms of the sweet receptor, things like sugar and processed foods stimulate the sweet receptor far more than fruit. And as a result, we actually downregulate our palate's sensitivity to sweet flavors, or simply to the sweet ligands. And this is why you oftentimes need more and more sweetener in order to evoke the same sweet sensation. Additionally, we never really stimulate these bitter receptors. And while most of the time they respond to chemicals, they also respond to phytonutrients found inside of fruit. And these are nutrients with actually fairly beneficial properties. And let's say we have a diet in which we eat a lot of sweet foods like soda and candy. We downregulate the sensitivity of our sweet receptors and upregulate the sensitivity of our bitter receptors. And this is simply because we do not actually stimulate the bitter receptors, so they begin to become more sensitive. And as I discussed, the sweet receptor will lose sensitivity due to overstimulation. And the same thing occurs with the umami receptors if we're ingesting savory foods like beer and pizza. Therefore, most people following the standard American diet will probably have very insensitive sweet and umami receptors and fairly sensitive bitter and sour receptors. So let's say you decide to make a diet change and you decide to switch out all your candy for fruit. If you are never exposed to these processed foods, you would find it extremely sweet. However, if you're following the standard American diet, the process I discussed earlier will typically manifest. So when you try to switch out sweets for fruit, you won't really sense the sweet flavors in fruit, but you'll be very sensitive to all of the bitter flavors in fruit. And this is why for many people, fruit tastes fairly bland. And the same thing occurs with eating animal proteins on the umami receptors. If our taste buds have downregulated to adapt to the sensation of things like beer, pizza, and other fairly savory foods, then eating animal proteins will probably taste fairly bland. And all of this will start to perturb us from trying to make dietary changes, simply because we perceive that we'll never be able to enjoy these foods. However, one of the coolest things about our taste system is that it estimates that our taste buds regenerate about every 10 days. And this is why you may burn your tongue and it takes a few days for you to regain taste, but eventually you do. And as these new taste buds come back on board, these new taste buds also have normal sensitivity. And this is where the idea of a palate reset could potentially be beneficial. Because one of the barriers to trying to make healthier lifestyle choices is simply not enjoying the foods that you're eating. But knowing that our palate so often regenerates, if we simply give ourselves 10 to 15 days of cutting out these extremely palatable foods and replacing them for normal foods that we've had throughout evolution, like fruit and meat, and other animal proteins as well, then over a course of a few days, fruit and meat will begin to taste like candy and beer. And obviously, if we return to eating candy and beer, they would taste extremely gratifying. However, these regenerated taste buds, because of their increased sensitivity, will actually respond to these sweet and umami flavors coming from fruit and animal proteins in the same way your old taste buds actually responded to these hyperpalatable foods. I just encourage you to give it a try and see how it works. And hope this information stops you from quitting halfway through, right before you are about to achieve the results of actually cutting out some of these processed foods. Personally, when I eat fruit, it tastes absolutely amazing. But I can't say that this has always been true. I actually watched this process occur firsthand because when I first tried to cut out some of the processed foods and replace them with things like fruits and animal proteins, for a period of time, these foods actually tasted extremely bland. But nowadays, it feels like they have an entirely new flavor. And this is where you get to the point of enjoying eating healthy foods and not actually craving some of the processed foods. And yes, this is completely anecdotal, but I have seen it work for other people and simply just encourage you to give it a try.